Hang 'em High might just be Clint Eastwood's most underrated western, so let's take a look behind the scenes of the movie with 20 things you didn't know about Hang 'em High, including how it almost became a Sergio Leone film, why Clint Eastwood threatened to quit the production, and a breakdown of all the hidden references that you might have missed. So Hang 'em High was written by Mel Goldberg and Leonard Freeman, who were both experienced TV writers, with the latter actually being the creator of the popular TV crime drama Hawaii Five-0. But despite this, neither writer had all that much experience writing movies, especially westerns, even though Leonard Freeman did previously appear in an episode of The Lone Ranger. Now, although Hang 'em High was largely a fictional movie, it did draw heavily on real historical themes and events from the Old West. For example, the character of Judge Fenton was actually based on a real-life judge called Isaac Parker, also known as the Hanging Judge, who sentenced 160 people to death, believing that strict law enforcement was the pathway to successful civilization. So by 1967, Clint Eastwood had rocketed to stardom thanks to his role as the man with no name in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. However, as a result, Eastwood spent much of his time dubbing for the English language versions of those movies, or doing endless interviews about them on the side, which left the actor feeling angry and frustrated. So when Sergio Leone flew out to LA to pitch him the role of harmonica in Once Upon a Time in the West, Clint Eastwood turned him down, uninterested in starring in yet another ensemble spaghetti western. But ultimately, the decision proved costly, as the movie ended up being a cinematic masterpiece, and is widely considered one of the greatest westerns ever made. Around this time, Clint Eastwood also turned down starring in another high-profile western called McKenna's Gold, featuring an all-star cast that included Gregory Peck, Omar Sharif, and Telly Savalas. And although the project might have initially seemed like a safe bet on paper, Eastwood was wise to pass on it, as the film ended up being a complete critical and commercial failure that might well have damaged his career. So Clint Eastwood clearly gave a lot of consideration to what film he should star in next, likely well aware that most people only really knew him for his role as the man with no name. For that reason, he was very wary of being typecast, but still wanted to take on a role in the same sort of tough guy mold that had made him so famous. That was why he was so impressed upon reading the script for Hang 'em High, as it was an American revisionist western that felt like a cross between Rawhide and a spaghetti western. He also liked that it had a similar plot to the Oxbow incident, which was one of his all-time favourite westerns. So Clint Eastwood ultimately agreed to star as the character of Jed Cooper, but under the condition that he also serve as a producer, granting him some level of supervision over every level of the production. So once Clint Eastwood agreed to star, he had a big say over the decision of who should direct the movie. And in the end, he opted to go with a director that he knew he could trust, and picked Sergio Leone. However, the Italian director was already deep in production on Once Upon a Time in the West, so he had no choice but to turn Eastwood down. So during the search for a director, the studio behind the film, United Artists, put together a long list of established directors that they felt would be a good fit, including Robert Aldrich and John Sturges. However, Clint Eastwood was adamant about finding a director that he knew he could trust, leading him to endorse Ted Post instead, a well-established TV director that he'd worked with in the past, having previously helmed over 20 episodes of Rawhide. But this was met with a lot of pushback, given that Post had very little experience directing feature films. However, Clint Eastwood used his considerable influence to force through the appointment. Now, when it came to casting, director Ted Post was keen to hire actors that he and Eastwood had already worked with in the past. So a lot of the actors from Rawhide were offered roles in the movie, including Pat Hingle, Ed Begley, and Charles McGraw. Another important casting to get right was the character of Rachel Warren, the customary love interest of the movie. So Ted Post decided to go with the relatively unknown television actress Inga Stevens, who was somewhat reluctant to work on the movie, given that she had no idea who Clint Eastwood was. This later proved ironic, as it was widely reported that the actress ended up having an affair with Eastwood during their time working on the movie. Hang 'em High also featured some pretty big-name cameos of actors that would later go on to become huge stars. For instance, a young Bruce Dern makes an appearance ahead of his long career in the Western genre, in films such as The Cowboys, Wild Bill, Django Unchained, and The Hateful Eight. Dennis Hopper also has a minor role in the movie, months before filming his breakout role in Easy Rider. Another important element of the film to get right was its location, because although most of the interiors would be shot at MGM Studios, they still had to find somewhere to shoot that could pass for 1873 Oklahoma. So writer Leonard Freeman took a drive out to Las Cruces, New Mexico, in order to scout locations, and that same day managed to find the tree that was used for the hanging scene at the start of the movie, which nowadays is no longer standing. Likewise, the river next to it has since completely dried up, and is now overgrown with thick brush. An equally important element of the movie was its music, so they decided to go with composer Dominic Frontieri, who was reportedly given just 8 days to compose an Ennio Morricone-type score. Despite this, he did an excellent job, with the title theme even going on to become a top 10 hit for the group Booker T and the MGs. It also featured in a medley of spaghetti western music by the band Wall of Voodoo, and My Chemical Romance also referenced Hang 'em High with a 2004 song of the same name. So once filming on the movie began, Clint Eastwood took a very active role in its production, especially with its script, often altering dialogue and other minor elements. For example, this scene was originally set in a saloon, but Eastwood had its setting changed to make it more believable. Equally, the fight scene with Bruce Dern was choreographed almost entirely by Eastwood. However, probably the most significant change he made to the script was the addition of an early scene in which Jed rescues a car from being swept away by the river. This is because Eastwood knew that he was going to spend the rest of the movie playing a vengeful, cold-blooded killer, so he felt that there needed to be a scene early on that established him as a hero and an innocent guy, making it clear from the outset that his character was a lot different to the self-serving anti-hero that he'd played in his last 3 movies. Now, Clint Eastwood wasn't the only one working on the movie who wanted to make changes to it during the shoot, because at one point its writer and producer Leonard Freeman appeared on set requesting all sorts of creative changes. This frustrated director Ted Post so much that he decided he needed to confront him. However, Clint Eastwood stopped him and said that he would go speak to the writer instead. And true to his word, Eastwood calmly walked over to Freeman and said, "If you come on this set again, we all walk." Following this, the writer was never seen on set again. Now, as much as Clint Eastwood viewed Hang 'em High as a chance to branch out from his iconic role as the man with no name, the actor still managed to include a sneaky reference to the Dollars trilogy, because the holster that his character wears in those movies is identical to the one Jed wears in Hang 'em High. So another reason why Hang 'em High was so important for Clint Eastwood and his career was because it was the first movie out of his new production company titled Malpaso Productions, which he was able to set up with the money that he made from the Dollars trilogy. And the basic idea behind it was that it would give Eastwood a lot more leeway over the films that he was starring in, given that he'd also be producing them, which was the case with Hang 'em High. And this arrangement suited Eastwood so much that Malpaso ended up serving as the production company for almost all of his movies moving forward, including his westerns. Now, Hang 'em High was not without its controversy, because it was actually considered a pretty violent movie for its time, so much so that it earned the film an M rating in the US, and even had some of its more graphic scenes cut whenever it was broadcast on TV. So when Hang 'em High finally released in 1968, it was a big box office success, making $10.8 million on a budget of just $1.6 million. In fact, there was so much excitement for the film that it had a record-breaking first day, becoming the biggest opening for the studio in its history, exceeding all of the James Bond films that had released up to that point. It even earned more at the box office than any of the Dollars trilogy films, as well as Once Upon a Time in the West. So Hang 'em High delivered Clint Eastwood quite the payday, as he reportedly signed onto the film for a salary of $400,000, as well as 25% of its net earnings. So following its record-breaking success, Hang 'em High went down pretty well with critics and audiences alike. For instance, Arthur Winston of the New York Post described it as a western of quality, courage, danger, and excitement. But not everyone was so complimentary, with Variety calling it a poor American-made imitation of a poor Italian-made imitation of an American-made Western. Nowadays though, Hang 'em High is widely viewed as a solid, if not groundbreaking Clint Eastwood Western, that's unfortunately pretty overshadowed by his earlier and later work within the genre, which will prove to be far more memorable in the long run. Now, even though Hang 'em High didn't quite have the legacy that Clint Eastwood might have hoped, it still proved to be a significant film in his career. For instance, his turn as an intense, morally ambiguous law enforcer very much feels like a precursor to his role as Dirty Harry 3 years later, and likely had a big influence on that casting. And more importantly, the success of Hang 'em High proved that audiences were willing to watch Clint Eastwood in a Western even if he wasn't playing the man with no name, a reality that Eastwood made the most of moving forward, starring in another Western just 2 years later called Two Mules for Sister Sarah. Now, out of interest, let me know below, what are your thoughts on Hang 'em High? Is it underrated or overrated? And if you enjoyed the video, as always, it would massively help me out if you could leave it a like, and you might also want to check out this video right here.